Fernando. How was your week?
Hi, Emily. All well. Good
Good.
week.
Yay.
Very good week. Productive. How about yours?
I feel like it was a blur. It went by in a blink.
I hear you.
All right. I think people are trying to get into the meeting and then we can get started.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Sarah, how are you doing?
Hello, hello. Good, thanks. How are you, Emily?
I feel like I'm still expecting it to be Wednesday and realizing it's Friday.
How does that happen? I know the time just keeps moving forward, whether we recognize it, acknowledge it, or want it to. Yes.
Very much so. All right, I just want to make sure everybody can get in and get started.
Fernando, will I see you tomorrow at chicken processing?
You do what?
Will I see you tomorrow at the ag hall?
Tomorrow? What's happening at the alcohol?
The chicken processing?
Oh no, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not coming.
Okay.
I was let off the hook. I was going to help with the interpreting, but Anna said that I could take the day off.
What did you say? Anna said you can take the day off?
Not you when I'm McCaffrey. The other Anna.
I'm gonna say, if Anna's in charge of days off, I want to befriend her. All right. Thank you guys for making time to be here. Is everyone who's got their camera off kind of here and ready to go? Okay. Yay, you made it, Marina.
I'm here just inhaling food. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So if we're ready to go and comfortable, let's get started. I think the only person I don't know is Andrew, but I don't know. Does everyone in the Zoom room know each other? I don't know if we want to start with intros super fast or if before we get started. Sort of background about why we're here. MV CYANO was a response to how do you quantify cyanobacteria and cyanobacteria risk in island ponds. Marina was among the initial group, as was I, who was trying to figure out how to solve this problem in 2020. And we worked to come up with a rubric that could be used to make decisions ahead of time. So when the data came in, public messaging could come out a lot faster to the public. I know, Andrew, you folks at the Wampanoag Environmental Lab have a different method that we'd love to learn from you guys as well. So there's kind of crosstalk. But today we're going to focus on the matrix that's behind our data. In terms of workflow, I'm going to bring up our draft matrix for this year, which is really last year's matrix, and think about areas where we might need to think about things to add or update numbers within the matrix based on new data or studies that have come out. And I'm going to go through sort of areas where we might want to consider those updates. Then we're going to walk through this week's first MV CYANO data. Owen and the team went out on the pond, on Eggertown Great Pond this week, so we have data for Bryce and Fernando to review. And then we have a tentative map based on those readings. And then we want to go through the cyanotoxin data that Hillary provided from the EPA. Thanks, Drew, again for that. We have anatoxin and saxitoxin information, but Owen's broken it down, as has Carly, into things that we can digest a little bit more. And because that goes into toxin information, it would be good to go back to the matrix because we might want to update some of those standards. So let's start, or does anyone have anything they need to bring up before I get started? Okay, here we go. So the matrix sort of behind the decision making, and I can make this a little bit larger, is it's based on stoplights. This we can thank Matt Poole for these stoplights. He suggested make it as simple as you can for the public and they understand stoplights. So this is what we came up with in 2020. Essentially thinking about different factors that influence ponds. If you have this information about the pond, what does the public need to know? What's safe and what's not safe? And so green is essentially very low cyanobacteria concentration. From our device, this is 0 to 0.5 micrograms per liter. Yellow is where you get between 0.51 and just below 10. Orange goes into 10, and then above is red. These are things that we came up with a couple of years into MV CYANO based on usage of ponds, but these data right here, concentration of cells, are based on EPA and Massachusetts recommendations and World Health Organization. The cylindrospermopsin and microcystin levels are Massachusetts DPH and EPA. The anatoxin recommendations came from Vermont because Massachusetts still doesn't have a standard for that. So this essentially is the background behind when we have data, how's it interpreted, but then the boards of health take this information into context with public usage at various sites. And so things to consider this year that might be different than previous years is we have saxitoxin and anatoxin data this year from the EPA that Owen will walk us through. It might be worth having a saxitoxin standard in here because we are detecting saxitoxin in some of our ponds. Another thing of note that we talked about last week is Vermont seems to have dropped their anatoxin limit for recreational waters to 8 and not 10. So it might be worth reflecting that. We know Mass DPH is saying they think they'll probably start putting a limit up for anatoxin, but they haven't yet, which is why we're deferring to Vermont. And then additionally, because we have saxitoxin in here, Carly pulled together saxitoxin standards from across the country, and Owen's going to walk us through that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing here and bring up data from this week. And for us, we've got a new team member, Ben. I don't know if Ben's here because the camera might be off. Oh, no, Ben's not on the call, but we'll introduce you to Ben when he's here sometime. But you guys know Carly and Owen, but Ben was also part of the data collection this week. So just bear with me for a second and I'll get the next one up. Share screen. And okay, so if we look at a whole lot of data on a spreadsheet, what I actually want you to see is here. We have the location. These are the Eggertown Great Pond stations. These are Jacobs Pond, which is an inlet that's sometimes connected to Eggertown Great Pond, but we still code it as Eggertown Great Pond. The date the samples were collected, the time. If you want to look at total chlorophyll, this is additive. This is all the green algae, cyanobacteria, diatoms, and cryptophytes. This is a correction standard. So what we're really looking at is how much green stuff is growing in the pond, and we're concerned about cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, because it's toxic, or it can produce toxins. The great news, Bryce and Fernando, is that we're detecting zeros for the main body of the pond. In the water column, we have more zeros in Jacobs Pond, but we had a benthic mat, and that was 10.97, which if we look strictly at the map tier, that would put us into orange or the matrix. But there's a lot to think about with benthic cyanobacteria, and we started this discussion. This is something we might want to incorporate into the matrix, what percent cover is present and things like that. Another thing, total chlorophyll, if we're above 10, that can put us in a different standard. So just strictly looking at the matrix, this would be color-coded orange. But Bryce, this is going to be a call for you and a kind of be a bigger discussion. So if we look at the map from that, and I'm going a little bit fast, so if you guys want me to slow down on anything, please let me know. If we want traditional calls and we're just calling from the matrix, the map would look like this. But you might want to adjust the color of this dot here, depending on what you'd ultimately decide with the matrix. And if you keep it orange for the watch, or if you make it an advisory. And that's something we need to think about: presence, absence, percent cover, or strict concentration of cyanobacteria. But Owen's going to walk us through data on with toxin information, which I think will make the call clearer. So Bryce and Fernando, for now, pre-discussion, does this make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Post-discussion, you might want to change it, but I want to just make sure so we're walking through the thinking. If we were making the call last year, this is probably how it would have been coded. Owen, could you take us through what you've learned on the toxin data with Hillary?
Sure. Let me share my screen real quick. Let's see. Okay. Can everybody see that okay? My slides? All right, perfect. So as you guys will remember, we sent a fair amount of samples off to the EPA lab up in Chelmsford last summer. Hillary got back to us with the data last week. As a quick update on the EPA lab for this upcoming summer, right now, Hillary said we're still a go to be able to send samples to their lab this summer. But if things change in terms of funding or their capacity, he'll let us know. But right now, we're good to go. So yeah, I'm going to kind of focus on the toxin data that we got back from the Gobler lab. Sorry, not the Gobler lab, from the EPA lab. Like Emily had said, so microcystin and cylindrosmeropsin, mass DPH has set advisory limits for those. They haven't for anatoxin or for saxitoxin. Again, anatoxin, we had established these limits, I'm not sure when, a couple of years ago, potentially in accordance with the Vermont standards. Saxitoxin, we don't currently have standards. So hopefully this data I'm about to show right here might kind of lead us in the right direction. So anatoxin A, we attended a mass DPH workshop last week where one of the main things they really stressed was that, we collectively, public health advisories, kind of need to focus or put more attention on anatoxin because it is a pretty potent neurotoxin and it is commonly found in Massachusetts. It's often associated with benthic cyanobacteria, not exclusively. It can be synthesized by Platonic cyanobacteria, but often in those benthic mats we do, that is maybe the toxin of concern we want to look at. What you'll see here is a bunch of numbers that Carly pulled out. And what we're seeing here is these are US states anatoxin A limits. Vermont's the only state in New England that currently has an anatoxin limit. Beyond that, we kind of had to go to some other parts of the country. Here on the left is the recreational standard that's been set by each of these states. Down here, MV CYANO, this is our current standard, which is 10, which was formed with Vermont standard at the time, which is 10, but they've since dropped it to 8. I think sounds like we may be leaning towards 8 right now. It is the same that is used by Ohio. These are both more stringent than a lot of other states like California, Oregon, Pennsylvania. Washington is more stringent with 1, but 8 kind of falls into that range. And in terms of drinking water standards, we've got Vermont currently has 0.5. I don't think they differentiate between infant and adult. And the other thing I should mention is that when we're looking at the column I've called infant drinking water, this isn't necessarily just infant. It's also kind of set for people who may be predisposed to being more susceptible, people who may have certain health conditions, who are older, pregnant women, and infants as well. But as you can see, the most stringent one is Ohio at 0.3. Vermont 0.5. This is what we currently use, 0.5. 0.5 kind of falls right into that, I say, median range. So that's just kind of comparing our standards to some that have been set by other states. Here is our results from Hillary Snook at the EPA lab. We sent a fair amount of samples off. One of the things I do want to note here is that I had to kind of read through Hillary's annotations a bit to pull this out. But detection limit, so basically the EPA uses 2 terms, detection limit and reporting limit. Detection limit, which for anatoxin is 0.1 micrograms per liter, is basically the limit at that they can actually detect anatoxin. But from 0.1 up to 0.3, they don't necessarily have full confidence in the ability of the test to be accurate. So only above a concentration of 0.3 would they basically say confidently that that's what that concentration is. And so only 2 of our samples had anything above the reporting limit. They're both here highlighted in orange. So there's Mink Meadows Pond in August and Jacobs Pond also in August. If we're kind of comparing the concentrations versus our current thresholds, they would both fall into the orange bloom watch. They're both above this 0.5 micrograms per liter, but they don't reach 10, or they also don't reach 8 if we were to change it to 8. I quickly want to show you where these 2 kind of higher hits of anatoxin fall kind of in a timeline. So again, you guys have seen this figure before. On the left, we have ambient water, so just standard water grab. On the right, we have cyanobacteria concentration for the actual kind of physical material, microalgal material we saw at Mink Meadows Pond. What we see here is this circle right here. This is when we got that higher antitoxin hit. And we also have a comparative sample here from just a standard water grab. The standard water grab itself yielded no antitoxin, but the material itself, when tested, had a higher measurable antitoxin concentration. This is kind of falls in place with what the literature says. Often, antitoxin in benthic samples is really confined solely to the physical macroalgal material. That isn't to say that it can't leach into the surrounding water column. It can, but oftentimes it does remain more intact with the material. That to me may potentially point to more of a danger towards dogs, potentially, as they would be more likely to ingest this physical macroalgal material than maybe humans would. Kids might also, put it in their mouth, but dogs potentially might be the bigger issue. And jump to James Pond as well. James Pond, we had a very similar story. So the physical macroalgal material.
Is this James Pond or Jacob's Pond? You've got both on the slide.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't catch that. This is Jacob's Pond. Sorry, yes, Jacob's Pond in Edgartown. Good catch. So yes, here's kind of pictures of what it looked like last summer. This is this kind of benthic green film on the bottom of the pond, right at the inlet that connects Edgartown Great Pond to Jacob's Pond. The material itself, when tested, had 0.8 micrograms per liter antitoxin, so measurable antitoxin concentration. Whereas the actual water taken right at that same location had pretty negligible. So what we're seeing across these two states, ponds that had antitoxin hits, is that it's in the material, it's not necessarily in the water. I also want to jump to saxitoxin. So saxitoxin is a toxin that I'll show you in the next slide. We did measure it in a fair amount of ponds. We don't currently have a limit in MV CYANO for saxitoxin. Mass DPH also doesn't have one, and Vermont also doesn't have one. So what I've displayed here, saxitoxin, I guess I should say, is also a potent neurotoxin, often associated with paralytic shellfish poisoning, and it's produced by cyanobacteria as well as marine dinoflagellates. So as we can see here, recreational 8 seems to be a recurring number. Ohio has a very low one of 0.8, which I almost wonder if it's a typo on their website. But I don't necessarily know if that's true or not. But yeah, 8 seems to be kind of recurring between Oregon and Pennsylvania at the very least. Washington has alternative methods of kind of assessing this, so they have a much higher limit for whatever reason. If we look at drinking water, 0.3 is kind of the lowest we get outside of this specific 0.02 threshold Oregon's established for dogs specifically. This is actually below the detectable limit or the reportable limit for EPA, so I don't know how much use that number would be to us. But quickly, just keep this 0.3 number, the lowest one that's out of all of these. Here's our EPA saxitoxin results from 2024. Detection limit is 0.015 micrograms per liter, so they go lower than antitoxin. And the reporting limit, so where they feel confident in reporting these numbers, is 0.04. And as far right, anything that says ND is basically falls below the reporting limit. So as you can see, relative to antitoxin, there's a lot more that are above the reporting limit, so that they feel confident in saying. Fair amount of ponds here: Chilmark Pond, Edgartown Great Pond, Tisbury Great Pond, kind of the full gamut in some ways. The 2 that I've highlighted here in yellow are above 0.3 micrograms per liter, which, going back to this slide, is kind of the lowest threshold we see across all these states. So I pulled those 2 as maybe more notable. And I'll do the same thing I did for antitoxin, where I kind of place them in terms of a timeline. So first, this is Chilmark Middle Pond. This is kind of the northern tip of that pond. Here's a picture of what we were dealing with on the day we collected this saxitoxin sample. Algal mat kind of covering the shoreline here. Again, very similar to antitoxin, we have a higher hit in the material and more of a negligible kind of hit in the actual water itself, so more confined to the material. I will jump to Jacob's Pond. Sorry, again, this should be Jacob's Pond, not James Pond. And very similar story again, kind of keeping the same trend going here, higher in material, lower in water. So that's mainly what I have in terms of looking at our saxitoxin and antitoxin data. I do wonder what you guys' thoughts are on establishing a saxitoxin threshold for MV CYANO, given that we don't have one. People have thoughts. I think we feel that it's probably worth doing, but obviously this is your call, so we'd be curious what you think.
Could you bring back up the slide with the saxitoxin comparison standards, please?
Sure.
Thanks. We'd love to hear from you guys because this is your wheelhouse, not ours. And I think that, Marina, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we set orange at the drinking water limit and red at the recreational limit for some of these. Or one time we talked about infant for one and adult for another. So it really depends how you guys want to play it. And one thing to remember is we don't have a time series of toxins. We don't know if we're hitting it at peak toxin or after it's dispersed a little. The literature suggests that you're going to have your highest toxin level when your bloom starts to die off or is dying off. But we don't have a time series and we don't get this data until a year later. So when you're making all of your very complicated decisions, know you're not going to have it in real time and you may not be hitting peak bloom. So there's a lot of variables. Marina, I don't know if you wanted to share any insight on when we were setting these before.
It's been a long time. First, one thing that stands out to me, probably Oregon had dog fatalities. You know how you say every dead kid creates regulations, etc. That stands out to me. I would like to see intensive public education about the difference between ingestion and casual intact skin contact. And another thing that I think that our yellow category is very easy for the public to misunderstand, and essentially I wouldn't post it anymore because it really doesn't say anything. It really just says it is possible for toxin formation is theoretically possible. Like, it's not going to form in your cauliflower soup in your fridge, but it is possible right now in this pond. It's not there, really. So in our setting the levels, okay, now as to this additional toxin, yeah. The recreational level, and what do we use as the standard for recreation? Do we go with the most vulnerable creature that could possibly enter that water, which in this case is dogs because of their complete lack of control about ingestion? Or do we go with when we start indicating that people should not engage in any recreation whatsoever? That's to me, I'm sort of struggling with our with how we set those limits.
Okay.
And that we were extremely conservative. I would love to look at more data from states that have ridiculous levels. The black category. I'd love to see the medical data about harm, so that we can better assess what we're saying to people they should and shouldn't do. Plus, I'm hoping that data on consumption of, for example, shellfish versus finfish versus mammals that drink the water versus, that research is evolving over the last years. So these are some of the things that come front to mind for me.
Okay. Thanks, Marina, for that. How about other folks I think the question on the table right now is if we want to add a saxitoxin standard to the matrix, and if we do, at what level?
I think we should definitely add one. You can use, I would also want to err on the side of caution. So kind of have a lower threshold for it, if that's what you're asking.
Okay. So are you thinking infant drinking water for one part of the matrix, or are you thinking recreation? Because I think what we've been doing is putting infant drinking water as orange and then recreation as red is what we've done in the past. Is that, what are you suggesting? How do we bring in a standard? Go ahead, Marina.
I have a question about the infant drinking water standard. Is this an honest to goodness drinking water standard? Or is this a recreational water ingestion standard? Because there's a huge difference of bioaccumulation and frequency of exposure, etc. I mean, drinking water is a very, also the EPA in drinking water makes a big distinction between a facility that you only occasionally, that you will occasionally drink from versus the house where you live and drink every day.
This,
So
I believe the drinking
standard?
water limit is if this was your sole source of water, you would want it below this level for infant drinking water or anyone who's immune compromised or
right. So that is your sole source, your household level. So that is extremely conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And we should take that into consideration as well. And the levels we have been seeing.
We've never tested saxitoxin before. This is the first time we have the data.
Okay.
So this is kind of a new thing. So this
I'd love to see a bit of a history of testing on, you know, to see where we stand with this.
I wish we had that data. Even Mass PPH has zero data for brackish ponds. So kind of in a blind area. Drew, what were you going to say?
Looking at what our signs advise and what we're looking at for this data, I think what your suggestion makes the most sense for orange being infant and red being recreation. But also, I'd be curious if Marcella or Andrew had any thought or input on saxitoxin since it seems relatively new.
Yeah, you guys might have data going back further. Your insights would be valuable here.
We're not looking exactly at the saxitoxin or the toxicity, but one of the difficulties I think comes up is that it's not in real time. So without having that data in hand regularly, that threshold value is kind of a little bit after the fact, which makes that kind of difficult. If there was something a little bit quicker that we could gauge, simply, presence, absence, density, speciation, that might be a little bit easier in real time. To provide public health information rather than, in retrospect. And like you had mentioned, brackish is incredibly difficult because it's just something that's so understudied.
Yep. Really, you hit the nail on the head, Andrew. We will not have this data until looking back, like Owen walked us through it, where we can look at the ecosystem, we can see what part of the bloom we got the data. Ultimately, what I'd love is if we took some time series data this year, because our only cost is shipping it to the EPA, assuming the EPA is going to be open, where we look at a bloom that's intense and get it at the beginning of the bloom and the peak and post-peak. So we have more information for next year. So we're not really this is somewhat of a game here because we don't have these exact codings. We won't have this part of the matrix filled out in real time. We're going to have concentration of cyanobacteria. We're going to have ecosystem information, but we won't have this cyanotoxin data until later. We might have the microcystin data in 2 weeks. We won't have anatoxin and saxitoxin.
The only thing that helps you out is it's a 4-2 line. Yeah, that's what it is. 3-4.
Question. Maybe this was covered, and forgive me if I missed this, but toxins, am I understanding correct? Toxins can co-occur. So we could have cyanotoxin, saxitoxin, and then so we can have multiple toxins at one time, but you could also have one present and not another.
Yep.
Up until this point, we've focused on cyanobacteria.
We've focused on microcystin, which is one type of cyanobacteria toxin.
Thank you. Okay. So that said, so in my mind, without breaking down the different types of toxins, I think for the layman, it's either toxic or it's not toxic, right? There's risk of harm or there's no risk of harm. So I think that anytime there is a risk of harm, we have a responsibility to share that information. And I think in this situation, because the data is being newly collected, there's still a lot we don't know, but we can still determine whether something's toxic or not.
Or has the
So it-
potential, the likelihood.
Or
to
that
be
has a
toxic.
potential, right? So it seems to me that we utilize the information, the testing results that as they come in to make decisions, you know, using the same matrix that we have been using. Which numbers are the best? I'm going to defer to, you know, the group on that, because it seems to me, I like, you know, what Marina said is that, you know, the most vulnerable. So infants, animals, immune compromised individuals. And we base our numbers off of that population.
Other thoughts from people?
I lean towards what Andrew said and thinking that if we can't get this in real time, then it's difficult to put these signs out based on, you know, our threshold. That, granted, we could always put it in the maps. Would this be one of the EPA ones that we don't know about until the end of the season?
Yep, saxitoxin and antitoxin, the only way we're getting that is post-season. So putting it in the matrix maybe it's a silly thing. It's more of a thing for us to consider after the fact. Where does it fall? Like, was this a drinking water standard issue? Was this a recreational standard issue? This is something you would see this time of year. So you'll know when we took 5 samples, how many of them were at the recreational limit? How many of them were at the drinking water limit?
So, I mean, is this fair to just say, like, we could flag this as something that's important to look at with the EPA's information next year, but for now, we can't really make too much information on it especially with brackish water having even less data on it than.
If you want to do that, you absolutely can. This is all you.
I mean, other health agents' thoughts on that? Obviously, it's important, but if we can't do anything about it in real time, why put it in our matrix this year unless we can just circle back on it next year?
I think it makes sense.
Okay. So we won't have any interpretations for you next year when we get it. We'll have to interpret with you guys as we get it. And we'll bring up these standards again. If they've been updated, we'll have these, and maybe that's a better discussion when there's 2 years of data.
Mm-hmm.
And does that make sense to folks that where we can afford it, we get a bunch of samples so we can get a time series, and the more toxic ponds, the more concentrated ones, so we have a better discussion next year? Okay. If you could stop sharing, Owen, that would be great.
Sure.
All right. So we already have antitoxin in the matrix, but we also, again, won't have the data until the end. Do we want to keep the antitoxin the way it is, or did you want to adapt to the follow Vermont with their recommendations? We can also table that one to next year if you don't want to adapt it. The proposed change was going from 8 micrograms per liter, from 10 micrograms to liter per 8, because that's the recreational limit for a New England state that does have it. Need some agent input here.
Well, my question is, this is another one we can't figure out until the season's wrapped, right? No, that's not accurate?
No, we will never have this data until the spring of the following year.
Really inconvenient.
Yeah, I know. Now I understand better. So if we're not going to even have the information, why add it, right?
It would take the matrix we have so that when we have the data, we can say, oh, it fell into the recreation limit. It's just a standard thing. We can leave it how it is and we don't have to change it.
I mean, in terms of going back to review it next year, I'm not opposed to putting that limit at whatever Vermont's doing. I have no issues with that, just to give us a better record of what it would look like based on states around us. But
yeah, I agree.
Okay. So the proposed change, if people are willing, is just making this 8 keeping up with the standard. And the reality is we're not going to look at this data in context until about this time next year.
Yep.
Okay, because when we make the calls in real time, what we're going to be looking at is mostly these right here. We sometimes look at environmental diversity, hasn't really been helpful because you can see intense cyanobacteria blooms that are one species or just a couple of species. You can also see ones that are pretty diverse when we see complex mats. So this one hasn't held true, but these have been the consistent decision makers. The concentration of cells and the concentration of cyanobacteria, and the total chlorophyll of the sample. Two other things to consider with the matrix is how we want to think about pH. That was something that came up during the Mass TPH workshop. We know that if pH drops considerably, one thing to note is that that might be indicative of a bloom. So we also collect pH data at the time. So if you wanted to add pH information into the matrix, we could, but we don't have to. For instance, if pH drops to around 8.0 or more, or increases, becomes more alkaline, that might be an indication of a bloom. So if you wanted to adjust the matrix, you could put that in here. If folks want that, we can add that. If not, we can leave that off. Thoughts on pH?
I think it's worth it to put it in there.
Okay.
Now, people will still have that information in your weekly discussion, right? As you sort of look at your results? No.
Yep.
Okay, so you put it in here.
We would probably add in a column because we put in salinity. So Owen, probably you'd have to add in a pH column.
Right.
Yep. So I thought you meant general public, Marina. You all will have that information.
Okay.
We're not going to publish that for the public. So pH increases to, I don't know, how do we write this? Owen, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Increases above 8, maybe.
Okay, greater than 8. All right, and I think that would go in orange and red. Folks at the Wampanoag Environmental Lab, have you guys tracked pH with blooms or have any data on that? We've seen it increase when blooms are occurring.
Whenever we're sampling at certain sites, we'll always take a YSI reading with it too, and that monitors pH, so we have that information on hand.
Have you noticed when a bloom's occurring if the pH increases?
It's not something that we've kind of been aware of. We can look back on it and go back, but as of now, it's not something that we're really considering.
Okay, awesome.
What seems to be a little bit more correlative is a drop in salinity for the brackish system. So, the potentiality is already there. We're in a system that is high in nutrient load. I think the salt content is actually restricting it. And then, after a large rain or something like that, if it dilutes that salinity, it gives it the opportunity to bloom.
Based on the data and what we talked with Chris Gobler, so our 15 parts per thousand was kind of the salinity tolerance where we're more likely to see blooms above that. Did you have a salinity number where you're seeing that transition point, Andrew?
Salinity is pretty much below 14. It's usually maybe when it drops to, right. So, it's usually in that kind of level that it has the potentiality, but if it drops to maybe 12 within certain areas and then the very low flow and flush rate within Squibnocket, it's kind of a recipe for disaster over by the public beach area.
Yeah. One of the things, sorry, I don't know why I'm echoing. One of the things that's been happening for us, we were reading literature in the off season. A couple of things of note. Most of the times the toxins are associated with benthic mats, which Owen showed us in our data this year. 2 years ago in Tisbury Great Pond, when we had kind of clear water next to the mat and sent the mat for microcystin testing, we found microcystin in the water, but not in the mat in the same sample. We also read some articles, and one of the things they said is if you have slow moving water, it can be perfectly ripe for blooms, and you could have mat in one place and the toxin a mile downstream. So we're not really talking about stream systems here, but in terms of if the water is moving in a certain direction, you can have accumulation of your toxin away from your actual mat. So even though that's how it usually happens, sometimes you can see the opposite. So as you're assessing risk, it gets more complicated. And that sort of brings us to benthic mats. We spent a lot of time reading about that in the off season because that was one of the things that is it's newer to us, and it's not something that Mass TBH gives us a lot of guidance on. What we were reading is a couple of things. Dogs are attracted to cyanobacteria mats. So they're already at risk and they're actually attracted to them. Anatoxin is something that's often present in the mats. Benthic cyanobacteria has showed up in more ponds over time for us. But the things that we don't know is, say, the ambient water, the background water, there's no planktonic cyanobacteria, it's only in the mat. We can detect zero in that, but you put the material in and you could be orange or you could be red, but there isn't a huge percent cover in the area. This is kind of a question that was a case-by-case basis last year. If only a small percentage of the water, say 25% of the water had this mat, the mat lights up at red. Do we call that whole pond a red, or do you put that in orange? Is it presence absence? If the cyanobacteria mat's there, you go automatically to red, or is it a percentage of cover? Because we're not going to have the toxins in real time, but we know that benthic mats can be toxic, more than one type of toxin. How do you guys want to quantify benthic cyanobacteria? Is it a presence absence? Is it a percent cover? Is it a concentration of cyanobacteria in that mat? Because this week in Jacob's Pond, we have the ambient water, just the background water, no planktonic cyanobacteria, but the mat itself is ringing up at orange on the matrix. So this is, I guess, Bryce and Fernando. How do you want to call that? What percent cover is that in the pond, Owen?
Pretty low. Is it helpful if I pull up some pictures?
That'd be great.
My instinct is to go with the worst. You know, if it's presence, we call it as such.
Okay, and so this would ring in as a orange if we're just, okay, here's your water. Oh, this is it this week?
Yes, so this is Jacob's Pond as of Wednesday. So as you can see, this right here is kind of what we're seeing, this kind of green, fine, benthic film. In the past, it's been much, much more widespread. This whole kind of sand spit was kind of covered in it. This channel connecting the ponds was covered. It kind of extended into Jacob's Pond. And here on the left-hand side is kind of the adjacent shoreline on Eggertown Great Pond. In the past, midsummer last year, it was also kind of coating all of this. So right now, it's pretty much confined to this one little sand spit here. We didn't see it extend past that. For the most part, generally not super widespread right now.
Okay, so it's neither widespread nor a high concentration. It's that kind of moderate concentration in the orange. So Bryce, still same call, keep it orange?
I mean, I could go either way on it. I mean, I do want to err on the side of caution, and I'd rather we kind of get ahead of it in case it's going to get worse, which it might in the season, right?
Right.
So, and I'd rather be in a position where we can hopefully downgrade it rather than upgrade it, you know.
Okay.
And this pond gave us problems last year, so
it did.
Again, it's my instinct. I mean, I could be persuaded otherwise, but I think we should keep it orange.
Okay, perfect. I think that makes a lot of sense. We just don't want to ever make assumptions because it's a little bit more complicated than what the system was set up for, which was we're thinking about planktonic cyanobacteria, surface scum when this was set up. So how do we want to deal with this in the matrix? Do we want to just strictly, if the material is ringing in at orange, we keep it orange. If the material is ringing in at red, we do it red. Do we want to incorporate this into the matrix? Are there any other thoughts? We know what we're doing with Eggertown, Great Pond, or Jacob's Pond this week, but how do folks in general, agents, feel about this? And do you even understand what question I'm asking? Because this is a little bit weird.
Can you be a little bit more clear?
Yes, let me be clearer. What most people are used to interpreting is a surface scum. And the surface scum, you just take a sample of water and whatever concentration of cyanobacteria is there. When you get to mats, either if they're floating on the top or they're benthic and they're floating on the bottom, you have a concentrated accumulation or a clump of cyanobacteria. Those clumps could be widespread or those clumps could be isolated. The clumps with this technology, can do something called quenching. We can underestimate the concentration of cyanobacteria because we're doing light going through it. And if it's blocking it, you're actually under measuring how much cyanobacteria. So we can do some tests with freeze thaw, which when you do that, and we learned that through Hillary, you actually get higher levels of cyanobacteria reads because the quenching effect isn't there because you've lysed some of the cells. So with the question is, do we want to treat benthic cyanobacteria, which has a different habit? It's not just spread out and diffuse, it's more clumpy, the same way we're treating planktonic cyanobacteria that free floats and is distributed in the water column. Just the fact that it's patchy, we know sometimes toxins are associated with the patch and sometimes they're not associated. So it's more complicated. Do you want to treat it the same way or do you want to treat it differently is I guess what I'm asking, because they have different habits.
I kind of think the same way. I mean, especially if, it sounds like, it might not be all around, but if it's in one particular area of the pond, you think, okay, the pond is fine, but then you're walking your dog and it goes out a little ahead of you. All of a sudden it's eating a mat. So.
Okay. So
I agree.
What was that, Sarah?
I agree. Treat it the same. That's my instinct too, because there's still a risk of harm.
And Marina, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so the visual cues for the public in the case of these benthic mats are insufficient to give, I mean, obviously, if you let your dog range freely where you aren't, but the visual cues are not an appropriate warning for the public. I mean, I'm also thinking even of the floating ones, where the wind direction, by the time we get our signs posted, the wind has moved it over. And I'd love to educate the public about the visual cues, because we won't always be on top of where the stuff is. And if the public has some discretion about don't let your dog drink bright green scum on the surface, or this is also how it can look, like this picture here on the right.
Yep.
So that I'd like to emphasize that with the public.
And I think Carly, in the sort of Q&A, or no, the frequently asked questions in the flyer you put together, does it have images of the different types of blooms? I'm trying to remember. I know we put it in the presentation.
It has like scum and mat, but
okay. But maybe not this benthic. Okay, so Marina, we could add this to our website. That's something we could do. We can't put it in the printed materials because we've already, I believe, ordered that. Maria, is that correct? So we could do a newsletter about that and we can update it on our website, but the benthic blooms are not as noticeable. You can go out there and not pay attention. It almost looks like green colored sand. The floating mats are clumpy. In the past, floating mats were often just green algae, but more and more we're seeing a higher concentration of cyanobacteria in those floating mats. So they look different. So your idea, Marina, of getting some public education about this is a good idea. And the two ways I think we could do it is through a newsletter and through our website. If you guys have other public education avenues, let us know. We're happy to give you whatever images or data you need to do that. But
we do. We do, Emily. If you could send us, because we can blast the Facebook page, the Martha's Vineyard Boards of Health Facebook page. A lot of people, and actually we're posting directly now through the Martha's Vineyard Boards of Health Facebook page on Islander stock and also on the Brazilian Facebook pages. So people are being hit from both directions.
So Carly, could you create a campaign that says cyanobacteria can look at all these things, like these things? If you see it, make sure you keep your dogs out and contact your local board of health kind of thing. Just so people have a search image, it can look like any of these things. You most likely will see it in these types of ponds, and these are the risk factors, so that they can make sure they can, and you can put an MV CYANO link because it has all of your contact information as well. All right, hopefully that addresses people's thoughts on that. So what I'm hearing is we don't need any further updates to the matrix. We've added the pH, we've updated the antitoxin. Are there anything any other topics people want to consider for this year's matrix? We also, Andrew, Marcella, and I guess double Andrew. I hadn't noticed that. This is perhaps the first time you're seeing the matrix, so we're not giving as much background as we normally would. If you have questions, please bring them up. And Owen, maybe stop sharing your screen.
Yep.
It's Friday. Everyone's tired. Okay. Any other thoughts from folks, or are we okay with the matrix to proceed for the year because we're kind of in the season?
Hey, Emily, I just want to add, I think one more point in right there is, moving forward with the other aspects of this of potentiality when it comes to toxicity. I want to make sure that whatever you guys decide, for consideration of, I want to make sure that how we address this keeps faith in our institutions. I would hate to see us put out some sort of warning that restricts access and use to some sort of water body or activity, and then to later find out that it was in the green, it was actually safe, which we hope that everything ends up being safe. But if we restrict access and it's not exactly a public health issue at that time, people might not observe the warnings within reason come future. So, one example being is, Squibnocket Pond was on constant warning, and the signage, I guess, portrayed restriction to recreational fishing. And we had people who diverted their activities because they heeded the warning. And, to find out that they just incorrectly observed the sign because everything was in a yellow. And so they just assumed yellow or orange made it unreasonable for them to participate. So just for consideration down the line, I know we want to, keep public health as, in mind and try to use the most stringent standards necessary, but it could be problematic if we restrict activities a little too much and then people, stop listening to the warnings.
That's a really, really good point, Andrew. So you're talking about the public area in Squibnocket, the Chilmark side, because that's the only part we were sampling, right?
Correct. And
Okay.
so we had some tribal members who, looked at that and, decided not to utilize the pond, which is a little unfortunate. And, obviously, everyone's looking very closely at that area, but it might have just been a little bit misunderstood because it was cautionary. So rather than be cautionary, they just restricted themselves altogether.
Okay, this is a really good point, especially with the tribal community. We've been reaching out and asked for some tribal members to participate in discussions. We're actually recording this for folks at the Aquinnah Cultural Center so they can hear this discussion, because restricting people's access to sustenance and all kinds of reasons to connect to water is not an intent of the program. And as we're on tribal land, that has more things to be thoughtful about. So if a yellow was posted, that's sort of a warning that it's cyanobacteria season. I think Marina suggested we don't post yellows anymore, and I think that's been the general practice in recent years. So that would take that concern away. But if it actually is in the orange or in the red tier, what we saw was mats, so a localized clumps of cyanobacteria where toxins, or it was a high enough concentration that toxins could be present. That's the only reason or orange or red would have been posted. But it's also possibly localized, Andrew, because we only sample that one region of the pond, not the whole pond. And if it's restricting access to the whole pond, that's pretty counterproductive. So how, if say in June, we were registering concentration of cells 70,000 or greater, which would be the World Health Organization standard for concern and what fits in our orange tier. If we saw that in the Chilmark corner of Squibnocket, what would be the best way forward interacting with Aquinnah and the tribe because we're only looking at that one quarter? Like, how would we make that better?
Well, I think that's completely reasonable, is that once it breaks threshold, absolutely have it posted. It was the yellow warning that it was a little bit of concern, but at what point, like you said, toxins can be localized or they can actually transfer and move throughout the water system. I think when it shows up is it shows up as the entirety of the pond. It just makes it difficult because that is quite literally the only point of public access. There's kind of a secondary one down Howland Path in Aquinnah, but that restricts almost the entirety of the pond.
Okay.
Clarifying that that the signs that are posted refer to the area. It's it's beautiful on the website. Maybe do the signs contain any reference to the website? This is from a sample taken from here, or something that would let people know that this is not generalized to Squibnocket Pond as a whole. Could be really useful. Also, if the tribe is sampling a different part of Squibnocket Pond, to make sure that people know to check that as well, or because that is an issue with just this one small corner that does tend to often show the levels. That does not necessarily apply to the rest of the pond that is also used.
Is one option additionally, because we could make a subset sign, I guess, for this one pond that says this is localized to this cove. That could be one thing. We cannot post yellows. This is again Anna, we're gonna need your input because this is Chilmark, this is your jurisdiction, but it's crossing over to a pond that's in Aquinnah, so that's complicated. So we need both of you guys to think about it. If Aquinnah wanted to participate in MV CYANO and we're trying to open the door if that's of interest, you could bring as many samples as you wanted from across the pond, and we could test them, and you could have whatever signs you wanted, because this could be a localized, like low circulation area like Andrew brought up, and it could be the water quality is fine in the rest of the pond where there's more flushing and less isolation. So one way would be to have more samples taken. I don't know if that would be helpful or not.
I think the clarification of this is where this sample was taken, or that subsidiary sign, because I do find the maps with the dots very telling, but we're not going to post maps with dots. And if we can't imagine how many signs we'd have to produce for all different combinations of maps with dots. So some indication that you're not looking at something that applies to all of Squibnocket Pond. I would prefer, from Aquinnah's perspective, on the other side of the pond, to not have the yellow posted, because again, it is just an indicator that this pond is capable of having, and the conditions are here that would make it possible to have toxins in the water. It does not say toxins have been found in the water, the way the orange and the red do. So yeah, combined with ongoing, I like the idea of the Facebook posts, because it is more common for people to pay attention to those, to sort of see them in a casual way. So that is where I'm sort of headed.
Okay. And Anna, this falls into something that it's in your corner of the world, so wanted to know your input as well.
So last year we only had yellow posted, I think 2 or 3 weeks, and then it went to orange, and then I think it went to red right away. So we didn't really have yellow, as far as I remember, posted at Squibnocket. But I think having a little mini sign next to it saying it's just for this location would be helpful too, to make sure that we don't cause any confusion and people don't interpret it the wrong way. I think I also talked to someone who lives on the pond down the road there, who was interested in getting the water tested at their property. So, and I sort of emailed that lady back and said, we can do it on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis if you're willing to volunteer, because I can't really do that. It's private property. It's, I think, past the gate there. I need to reach out. Maybe she'll be interested in doing that. Let me see if she's around, that lady. I can't remember her name, but I think having another data point would be helpful to see how it changes going deeper in the pond, because that point is very shallow where we test. And yeah, so I'd be curious to see if it's showing different results at that other point. Let me connect with her.
Sounds good.
A quick point. We had a lot of confusion and questions about Seth's Pond in West Tisbury, even with very clear signage, red, toxins, danger. People were still using the pond. So our solution was just to simply come up with a laminate, I'm just going to laminate some, a Word document that says, for more information, for questions, call this, this, and this. And that way people have an opportunity, if they have questions such as, is it the whole pond? Is it this section of pond? Then we've given them the option to get more information. Just throwing that out there.
And then I have a question for Andrew. How many locations do you test?
Besides what we call S37, so the Squibnocket access point, we also test the Howland Path, which is the, I guess, Aquinnah public access point. We've tested within the center of the pond. There's a couple nodes that we test throughout the year. Essentially, it doesn't appear to really extend past the eastern point within the pond section, but we're not really actively testing the west, and from my understanding, that's going to be publicly open this coming year from, I think it's Sheriff Meadow or Land Bank, whoever purchased the Kennedy estate.
Land Bank has
so that might be a point of access now as well.
And does that fall on Aquinnah's land?
Yes.
Okay.
So I guess from what we can gather, the CYANO presence really doesn't extend past that easternmost little alcove, which corresponds very well with the MEP's nitrogen loading most significantly impacted area of the pond system.
One other thing is we got a similar equipment to what you have, Andrew, and I think our staff would love to cross-train with you, because I know we've made attempts in the past to have paired samples to see if we could match up our fluoroprobe with your fluoroprobe to see if we could kind of translate the difference or equate some numbers. Is that something that if Owen and Carly reach out, that they could schedule a time to learn from you guys?
Yeah, sure, not a problem.
Okay, that would be great, because I think as much sort of clarity and communication and crosstalk as we can do, the sort of better the ponds and the people benefit. That was a great point, Andrew. Are there any other thoughts and considerations as we're crossing boundaries? Ponds don't really stay in towns very well.
I think it was Marina's point about the educational material about like what to actually look for, I think is incredibly helpful. Obviously blooms can take different shapes, sizes, different views, but it can be easily misinterpreted. Is there too much pollen on the pond? Is it just filamentous algae that's growing there? And there just seems to be for especially summer folks who are not used to the coast or waters in general, they really just might not know. So, the more that we can provide for a visual aid, I think is very helpful. Because, let's call it how it is. There's a lot of signs on the island and a lot of people don't read.
His visual education would be better. Carly worked with the boards of health to develop sort of a frequently asked question flyer and basic information about MV CYANO. We're happy to send you guys the PDFs if that's helpful. It answers some of the questions about that, but public education, I think, isn't an issue here, and as many channels as it can come out and as many languages as we can. Special thanks to Fernando for making MV CYANO more accessible to the Brazilian community, because we were really missing that before. Okay, so Andrew, what's the best way to get you folks at the Wampanoag Environmental Lab access to things? We know to send stuff to Fernando for the Board of Health Facebook. How do you put out your information? We're happy to share what we have.
Sure. If you've got anything digital, we can send that through. We also have a tribal newsletter, which might be reasonable for us to put out, that just goes out to the membership. And then beyond that, even just directing folks to the Aquinnah Board of Health.
Sounds good. We'll be happy to share educational resources. Let's see. And Sarah says information can be added to the IIPHEC website. What is that?
That's the grant.
Yeah, a grant group we're part of, the Inter-Island Public Health Excellence Collaborative. Yeah, we've been working on a website. We mostly Patrick, Roden Reynolds. And so there's, we can add this information to the site as well. I think the more we spread the information around, then, the more likely it'll reach people.
So we can try to get a little information packet that can be in different forms, whether it's PDFs, images that can go out on social media, and a few different resources. And then we'll send it back out to this group, and maybe we could figure out who's on point to get it to which channel, who's bringing it to your international or to your collaborative, who's putting it on Facebook. And that way we know it's going out to everybody. Okay, that sounds great. Thank you everybody for taking time out of your busy season to be here. I think it would be great if we stay in contact. Folks, Andrew, Marcella, Carly and Owen will reach out about cross-training. I think we see at least some of you guys in Woods Hole for the CYANO Hab training. Who's going from your lab to that?
I am Marcella.
Oh, great, Marcella. We'll see you Thursday. Carly, Owen, and I are going.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
And then I guess thank you and stay in contact. Hopefully there aren't a lot of blooms, but if it's like the other seasons, we'll be busy. All right. Have a good weekend, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.